Great. Yeah, so I'm very excited to talk to you about neural operators as well as its application in a number of scientific domains, including those that are directly relevant for uh, dealing with climate change or understanding about climate, from weather forecasting, climate modeling, to modeling technologies such as carbon capture and storage for climate change mitigation. And of course, a lot of aspects of drug design as well as for, say, direct air capture. So many areas of how we handle climate change and how we are able to understand, model, and design can be sped up with the use of AI, and how neural operators enable us to do that by expanding on neural networks to handle this kind of continuous processes. And that's really the new idea here in terms of how, we don't just bring in existing AI techniques, but design ones that are relevant to capturing these kind of multi-scale processes. Yeah, such multi-scale processes are indeed very common in many scientific domains. In nature, if you think about modeling the molecular dynamics, in this example, I'm modeling how the coronavirus spike protein interacts with proteins in our body, or on the right, the processes at the planetary scale, uh, such as the atmospheric rivers for weather forecasting. And if you think about it, these processes, like are at very different scales, but they still are having mathematical models to describe them. So you can have mathematical models appearing at different scales. And also within a process itself, there can be multiple scales, such as, weather phenomena goes from microscale structures, such as how in clouds we have particles to cause precipitation, to planetary scales, such as these atmospheric rivers that are thousands of miles wide. So you have a very uh, long range of scales that interact together to cause weather on our planet. And so how do we model these different scales, and then how do we, uh, you know, capture that behavior and ultimately predict that on new unseen cases, such as future weather. And of course, the difference between weather and climate is weather is short term, so what we call medium range weather forecasting, where you have predictability from 1 to 2 weeks, and climate is something that is much more longer term, where we may not be able to exactly tell you the trajectory of what the climate is going to be a decade from now, but you can come up with statistics of what it is likely going to be. And so it's the same Earth, right? And the same kind of processes we want to model, but it's a different range of time scales. And so that's the other aspect too. There's both spatial scales and time scales that can be widely ranging in these processes. And we already have tools to solve these equations. Typically these are partial differential equations, and we have numerical solvers to be able to solve them. So why do we need AI, and why can't we just continue to use them like we've done in the past several decades? So the reason is the costs of computing solutions through numerical solvers is inordinately high. And these are some numbers I took from my colleague Tapio Schneider's paper, where the calculating, if you want to get to the finer scales and capture accurately the physical phenomena, for instance, the cloud turbulence, you would need to go to like much finer spatial and temporal scales compared to capturing other phenomena like convections and storms. And so to do that, you would need a lot more compute capacity than what we have today. something of the order of requiring more than 100 billion times computing than what we have on Earth today. So you cannot solve all this by brute force and try to accurately capture all the fine scale phenomena, right? And this is true even at the molecular scales. If you go to capturing quantum effects, we have the Schrodinger's equation, but that grows exponentially as you increase the number of atoms. So soon, even with just 100 atoms, the time required to compute that brute force requires more than the age of the universe on the current supercomputers. So you have all these really huge numbers if you want to get to computing some of the natural phenomena, right, at realistic sizes that we actually need to capture uh, the effects of fine scales accurately. And indeed, I mean, since this is out of reach, decades of research has been done on doing approximations, right? So maybe you don't capture this directly as brute force, but instead you try to make approximations, such as you try to average out the fine scales and try to approximate what that effect is, right, through averaging, what's known as coarse graining, for instance. And these approximations sometimes have even won Nobel Prizes, such as for DFT, for quantum chemistry. But then the question is, what can AI do? So AI could also help us approximate these multiple scales, right? So we can attempt to capture the effect of different scales with the use of machine learning and AI. And that may come up with very different approximations than what we are doing through our own ingenuity, or rather, what researchers have been doing through coming up with approximations that still many times have certain guarantees, right? And with machine learning, maybe we cannot always have guarantees, but we can empirically show that these methods are able to do well on the use cases we want. For instance, in the case of weather forecasting, our model is running at ECMWF and producing forecasts, like every day. So you can go check out, and weather scientists have been studying these AI-based models for the last several months. And so that's another way to think about this. Maybe we don't have all the nice theoretical guarantees that numerical solvers have, but on the other hand, we can now come up with machine learning methods that learn to solve, right, by effectively learning better shortcuts. So you can solve this much faster than what was possible before, sometimes as much as 1,000,000 times faster in some of the applications we've seen, such as plasma evolution in nuclear fusion. So there is the promise now with machine learning, you can learn better features or better basis functions than what was previously done through hand engineering. And I see a similar analogy to what happened with computer vision, right? So before neural networks, there was a lot of hand engineered features in computer vision. And once deep learning came along, it handily beat those approaches. And that's what we're seeing now with machine learning as well. And now the question is, can we use any machine learning method, any standard neural network, or do we need something more? And so, the aspect that makes these scientific problems different from standard, say, computer vision is in standard computer vision, you assume that the resolution of images or videos are fixed beforehand. So at training time, you have the same resolution, and at test time, you also have the same resolution. But that's not the case here if you think about solving different physical phenomena such as fluid dynamics here. So we can train on low resolution data, and we still want to be able to predict if we are given higher resolution inputs, right? So because the actual phenomena happens in a continuous domain, and we are allowed to sample that at different resolutions. And we should have that flexibility because sometimes you need to capture very fine scale information to really model the effects accurately. And that's the aspect that standard neural networks fail because they limit to one fixed resolution. And so we see that also in the frequency spectrum. So if you look at the frequency spectrum, the energy, so wave number, right, is related to frequency. So it's something that where in training time, you only have limited resolution. So the training resolution is limited because you only are given these trajectories that are of limited resolution. But at testing time, I do want to be able to predict what happens at finer scales or higher frequencies than what was seen during training. And so this ground truth is the dotted line here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in any case, I think you can see the dotted line versus the blue line is what our neural operator approach shows how well it predicts even beyond the resolution of training. So this is an extrapolation, right? Or it's a zero-shot super resolution because we've never seen these higher resolution information during training, but we are still able to predict that reasonably well. And the other aspect is you could use a standard neural network, let's say like a UNet, and then on top of it, you could add an interpolation like a bilinear interpolation. So with bilinear interpolation, now you can go to a higher resolution. But doing so means you are severely still distorting the finer resolution information, right? You're not able to capture that very well, and it's very far away from the ground truth. So which means that, standard neural networks don't have this inductive bias that it should also be able to fill in the gaps in between the grid points, right? Its purpose is to only learn what happens at the fixed resolution or fixed grid points and not in between. So it's not, interpolating in a nice way in between if you only added on top some fixed interpolation like bilinear interpolation, because these are quite nonlinear phenomena. On the other hand, the neural operators, directly learn an output as a function. So meaning you can now sample that at any resolution. And so it doesn't need an extra interpolation. It directly allows you to query at any point in the domain and at any resolution. And you can see that it's able to capture also the spectrum outside of the training regime, right, and still do pretty well. But we can further enhance these neural operators by not just having it be data-driven, but also physics-informed, meaning we can add in like losses such as, whether the partial differential equation is met or other kinds of physics-based losses. And by adding a combination of data-driven loss as well as the PDE loss, you can now get the ground truth spectrum and the one that is predicted by the model to be almost on top of each other, meaning you're now able to predict this ground truth spectrum or other kinds of information very well, even at finer resolution than what was seen during training. So you can think of it as intuitively what neural operators are doing is using the information of physics or these PDE losses to fill in the finer details when the training data has only limited resolution. So it's distilling both, having a PDE loss at a finer resolution and only coarser resolution training data and bringing all that information together. And neural operators allow you to do that because you can express now losses at multiple resolutions easily, right? So you can either have training data at multiple resolutions, or you can have data and then the losses informed by physics at different resolutions. And this flexibility allows you to combine all that information effectively. And we also have a library where we are extensively working on these methods, and it's open source, so I encourage you to go check it out. There's also tutorials and a lot of material. So let me talk about some applications. We've had success with neural operators, and then I'm happy to go into some more details of how we went about designing neural operators. But also, I don't know how the questions work here. If there are quick questions, I'm also happy to take them now, or if the preference is to wait until the end, that's fine too.
Do we have any questions in the room? Yeah, at the end, maybe. Yeah, okay. I think just for convenience, we'll save them to the end. Yep.
That makes sense, because remote, it's a lot more complicated. Yeah, so let's now look at some applications. I mentioned weather forecasting. Our ForecastNet was the first fully AI-based high-resolution weather model that we released, where there was quite a bit of surprise in the weather community that we could take the initial conditions and completely replace existing numerical methods with an AI-based method using neural operators to do forecasting that is competitive with traditional weather models, but also tens of thousands of times faster, right? So you have both the speed, but also accuracy coming with deep learning that wasn't possible before. So what used to take a big supercomputer that is CPU based to do weather forecasting in a traditional way now can run on a local gaming PC, like the one you may have at home. So our code is open source, it's Apache, anyone can use them. So I think there is a lot of, usage and excitement in building on top of these global weather models in the weather community. And it's also available as charts in ECMWF. So if you go and look up these machine learning based models, you can get forecasts right periodically. In fact, I think every 6 hours or so it is refreshed. And and this is something that is running right as we speak, and it has shown to be performing quite favorably with respect to traditional weather models. And sometimes there have also been better predictions than the traditional models. So I think this shows that weather forecasting is considered as one of the hard problems for numerical solvers, because there's all these higher resolution information you need to capture and many different variables, right? So we are not just talking about wind, temperature, humidity. So you have all these variables that you need to capture both spatially, temporally, right? Both across the layers of the atmosphere. So it's multi-physics and it's coupled PDEs, which is considered challenging. And on the other hand, these deep learning based models are able to learn directly to forecast and do quite well without needing to bottom-up model all of these phenomena. And just some details about our model. It's available, as I said, as open source. It's also available at the ECMWF GitHub. And some of the other findings was, on the left is the model that thinks that the Earth is a rectangle, whereas on the right is the model where we do model the spherical geometry. So meaning the layers of our deep learning model assume it's a sphere and we are integrating over the sphere, and we are using spherical harmonics as a way to learn the basis, but then we also add nonlinear activations in between to make it expressive. And so by doing so, keeping the spherical geometry, we can do much longer rollouts. I think this rollout was for more than a year or so and still keep the stability. Whereas models that expect the Earth to be a rectangle start developing distortions and blow up. And this is, I think, where the domain knowledge and geometry and other aspects, incorporating them is important, right? Because right now our training was to only predict for the next several hours, like say 6-hour increments, a few such time steps you can fine tune and say, I want to do autoregressively multi-step forecasting. But on the other hand, if I now roll this out for years, then that is extrapolation because you never trained your model to be run for so long. Because in training, you only did a short-term prediction task. And so we don't expect it to be good, right? In general, we do expect a model to blow up, and that's what we see if the model expects the Earth to be a rectangle. But on the other hand, having the spherical geometry helps it retain the stability for much longer and do this kind of extrapolation well. And in fact, I think it's the Allen AI Institute using our spherical geometry-based model or the spherical FNO model to be doing climate predictions, in a 10-year range or so. So you have this nice stability property. And that's something also as a theme to keep in mind when we're doing scientific problems with AI in terms of how to add in more of the domain knowledge, right? Geometry, or this aspect that we need to be able to capture multiple scales and using neural operators for that. All of this requires a bit more thought than doing a black box model. And the benefit is extrapolation because so much of scientific problems is not about doing only one fixed task that you can give as a loss function during training and only focusing on that, right? A lot of it requires us to extrapolate beyond the distribution of training data and beyond the settings of training regime. And that's where I think adding this goes a long way. And of course, the data in these settings are still quite limited. We used only about 50,000 samples to train these weather models, which is a far cry from language models. So adding more of this information in the right way can still help. Yeah, so far we talked about how we can get good predictions with machine learning based models while also being much faster than traditional models. What are some of the other advantages? You can also improve ensemble prediction, meaning if you think about extreme weather events like hurricanes, right? So it's what we call a chaotic event. So meaning you may not be able to exactly get the trajectory of the hurricane right if it's far off, right? If it's like more than a week away or so, you may somewhat be able to capture, but not fully. And instead of doing one deterministic prediction, the approach is to do an ensemble, meaning you slightly perturb the initial conditions and see how the prediction of the hurricane evolves and take all of those scenarios together and come up with probabilistic estimates, right? What is the probability the hurricane will hit the coast of Florida, for instance? And so this means the more ensemble members we have, better is our risk assessment. But what happens is in the traditional weather models, we are limited by cost. In fact, I was quite surprised to hear that you only have about 50 ensemble members in operational weather forecasts that we see. And we know if you average out or take standard deviations of only 50 numbers, you're not going to get good error bars, right? So we need much larger ensemble systems, and that's what these deep learning models are enabling. And in fact, our collaborators in Lawrence Berkeley Lab are using now ForecastNet and creating much larger ensembles to come up with very good risk assessment of these kind of extreme weather events. And it can be potentially much better than what we're able to do today. So it's not just, and I think that's the aspect to keep in mind. AI is not just bringing down the costs of current systems, such as the traditional weather forecast, which is already great. And it's great for the environment as well, because we can run these now in a forecast with much lower energy costs. But the other benefit is also we can do much better, right? With climate change, these kind of extreme weather events will only increase in frequency and intensity. And so we need to be able to at least get enough early warning for these extreme weather events. And that's what these AI-based systems can enable. And talking about climate change, in addition to climate modeling and extreme weather prediction, can we think about mitigation strategies? So one of them is storing carbon dioxide underground. And you need to measure the pressure. You need to be able to model how the carbon dioxide gas plume is going to move and migrate in these underground wells. And this is important because if your carbon dioxide escapes, then you haven't done your job sequestering it, right? So that's very important to come up with what are the suitable wells to store them, and how do we measure the pressure buildup over several decades and ensure also safety in terms of seismic activity and other issues. And what you saw in this visualization was our ability to do that over multiple wells using these neural operators. And this would require a very long time on traditional solvers. So our model is about 700,000 times faster than what you can do with traditional solvers. And this really now enhances our ability to, get to, if as a first place, doing better carbon accounting and asking, what if I did carbon dioxide storage? How many wells are suitable, knowing what kind of porosity and other properties they have, and how long can I store them? How does it evolve over decades? So it really makes it very convenient to do this kind of large scale study. And some of the companies are actually using this technology to do a full scale study. And there's so many other use cases where neural operators have sped up over traditional simulations, material deformation, right? Understanding how plastic is the material, and if we apply pressure, what happens to it? Ultrasound reconstruction, being able to reconstruct in real time the imaging and do that in high resolution. It's very important as ultrasound and other imaging technologies are becoming much widely adopted and getting to much higher, and the requirement of much higher resolution in many of these, for assessing tumors and other use cases. And then there's also nuclear fusion, where you see this is the image of the tokamak captured by the cameras with our collaborators of the UK Atomic Energy Agency. And what we did was use these models to learn the evolution of plasma and be able to predict disruptions before they occur, because then we can prevent damage of the reactor and find ways to get to sustainable fusion. So this ability to accurately predict how the plasma is going to evolve, which can become very unstable, is important. And if you use traditional simulations, which are magnetohydrodynamic simulations, it's about 1,000,000 times slower than what we can do with neural operator-based models. So this really now allows us to do these predictions in real time so we can take corrective action before issues like disruption arise. So far I've talked about forward prediction, meaning, knowing what is the trajectory of a hurricane or other weather forecasts or the plasma. But we can use AI models for inverse design, right? So on the left, what you see is a catheter which we designed using these neural operators, because the neural operator models were able to understand fluid flow inside a tube. So not many of you may be aware that catheter is used to draw fluids out of the human body, but bacteria tend to swim upstream and infect the human. And in fact, this is one of the most common healthcare related infections. And our collaborators had a neat idea where the inside of the tube, instead of keeping it smooth, let's add some ridges or these triangular shapes. And with that, there are vortices created so that the bacteria are prevented from swimming upstream. But the challenge was how precisely to construct the best shape of these triangles, right? How to design them in the best possible way to create the right level of vortices. And this is where we used neural operators, where we learned the forward model, meaning for each kind of shape, right? Each set of like these triangular shapes, how does the fluid flow change? How does the bacterial density change? And how many bacteria can swim upstream? And by modeling that, we could directly optimize for the best shape to maximally decrease the bacterial contamination. And so our AI model just directly designed a catheter rather than the traditional approach where you would do a lot of back and forth. You would go test it out in the lab, try to figure out what went wrong and come back. Instead of that, we now directly had a proposal for an optimized design. And what you see in the video below are the particles that is being tested in the lab. And you see the particles moving along the fluid flow, meaning they're getting pushed out, and very few of them are able to swim upstream, right? Which is where the infection would be caused if they're swimming upstream against the fluid flow, and that's hardly happening. And that's the benefit of using these AI-based approaches, because we can directly come up with an optimized design. And in fact, in the lab, we measured the bacterial contamination to be reduced by more than 100-fold. So you can get to good optimized designs and reduce the back and forth testing needed in the lab. There's similar aspects also with lithography, where we can do the inverse lithography or the optimized mask design to come up with the desired outcome or the desired shape, and be able to do that kind of optimized design very well. And this is another aspect that is much more advantageous with machine learning based models compared to traditional solvers, because traditional solvers are typically not differentiable. And so if you try to optimize for any quantity, you would have to do a lot of iterative forward solves, which would be very expensive and hard to converge. But because of natural differentiability of AI-based models, we can do design in all kinds of scenarios. So where do we go from here? So some aspects we are now working on is, in a way, the weather model was multiphysics. It had a lot of different interacting variables, right? And we could use machine learning based methods such as neural operators to solve them effectively. What about other kinds of such physical phenomena? Can we build like foundation models that can work on multiple such PDEs and do well. And that's what our recent work is showing, that we can indeed have a foundation model that can work very well on multiple tasks compared to a narrow model that is just trained on one task. You can also do generalization in a different way, where you first train on simple physics and then couple them to come up with multi-physics, right? For instance, you can have just fluid flow, and then now you want to fine tune where inside the fluid there's also wave propagation. So you have multiple physical phenomena occurring, and we can do that well, this kind of coupling, and be able to learn with just in a few short fine-tuning manner. And that's the promise of self-supervised learning and a foundation model, that you need very few examples downstream to solve even more complicated tasks than what was seen during training. Yeah, so so far I mentioned about predicting trajectories where there is the regime of predictability, right? But certain systems are chaotic. I mentioned about hurricanes. So if you slightly perturb the initial condition, you may get quite different looking trajectories. So the goal is not to precisely predict where the trajectory is, but really to come up with the uncertainty estimates, right? So in a chaotic system, you should not try to come up with a prediction, because you know that slight perturbation will make it deviate a lot. So it's not predictable. And instead, the goal is to come up with these essentially measures, right? So if you perturb the initial condition, how much will there be perturbation after some amount of time? And that's what ensembles do. And in certain systems, there could also be attractors. So the measure of like where these trajectories end up could be an attractor or an invariant measure. And we can also come up with the statistics of that invariant measure. And this way we can simulate and characterize the system without trying to predict trajectories, which is a very different way of thinking. If you're a machine learning person, you are always looking to predict if it's a time series or a video model. You always try to come up with good predictions, right? But here, the approach is not try to predict over a length of time, because you can't possibly do a good job with that. But instead, you only learn predictions for a short amount of time, and then you try to roll it out and then come up with these estimates of the attractors or invariant measure and characterize the system. And we can do that through various statistics after running these models for a while. And if we know that the underlying system is dissipative, and we also enforce that after we train our model to predict only for a short amount of time, and then we do the rollouts for a longer time, we can keep it stable and we can recover these kind of statistics. We can also look at non-stationary systems, and this is where it's relevant for climate change, because the many theories point to tipping points, right, where there can be unrecoverable drastic changes as you keep increasing the carbon dioxide. So the idea is, in this plot here, the carbon dioxide concentration keeps increasing, somewhat linearly, but suddenly the cloud cover just drops, right? So it's these because these are highly nonlinear effects, these may not be a smooth change in the climate conditions as we increase carbon dioxide. And that's further reason for us to, find ways to also keep the carbon dioxide under check. But we need to be able to study this kind of effects, what would happen under different carbon dioxide conditions. And so these kind of tipping points as well, we are able to predict using our models, where we combine the uncertainty prediction or estimation with conformal prediction, and be able to check where the tipping point may occur based on, whether there is deviation from known physics, right? And based on that, we can predict the tipping point well ahead of time before it happens in these models. And this can be very relevant for scaling them up to models that predict for climate change and tipping points there. Yeah, so those were some set of applications and high-level thoughts in terms of how machine learning-based approaches, especially neural operators, are impacting many different domains, and some intuitions we had about how you need to capture multiple scales. So that means multiple different resolutions, be able to maybe combine data and physics information together, be able to incorporate symmetries or geometries into the model, and those can go a long way. So now I want to maybe give a little bit more intuition into what are neural operators, because I didn't describe how we get this ability to predict at multiple resolutions and what makes them different than neural networks. In fact, you can think of neural operators as a superset of neural networks, right? So neural networks are special cases where you limit them to only one resolution, and neural operators are an extension where you can handle multiple resolutions. And that's kind of the main idea, that with neural operators, you can now have at test time, once the model is trained, you can change the grid, right? You can make it now a higher resolution grid, and you can still come up with predictions. You can also change the shape of the grid. You can have irregular grids and be able to come up with predictions. And the way to think about it is the same. If you have neural networks and you fix to one resolution, and then you zoom in, it gets blurry, right? As you can see in this picture. If you are limited to only one resolution, you zoom in further, the information gets blurry, so your details are not captured. Whereas with neural operators, think of it as the ability to keep zooming in indefinitely. So you can zoom into any resolution and come up with a prediction there. And so this allows it the capability to accurately capture the underlying ground truth, which is a continuous phenomena in many of these scientific domains. And the other way to think about it is, how you come up with predictions between, let's say, the input are these blue dots and the output or the target is the orange dots, right? So if during training time, let's assume these are two time series. So the input is a time series, the output is a time series. And during training time, I only show you what happens at these discrete time points. So you have no idea what happened in between these time points, right, in this time series. And so if you train a neural network to train at, say, time 1, time 2, and so on, at test time as well, you can expect it to do reasonably well at those specific times. On the other hand, you have no idea what happened between those times. And that's where neural operators instead approach the problem as learning mapping between two functions, right? So these functions now have support everywhere in the domain, not just on the discrete grid points. And you're learning mapping between these two functions. And in this simple example, I'm showing you functions that are made up of superposition of sinusoids. So if you took like a Fourier transform, that would be one way to think of having a continuous extension of both the input and output, right? So that's one simple example, but you can now have other basis functions that really captures the fact that your input and output are functions on some continuous domain. They're not just on these discrete grid points. And because neural operators model the output as a function, you can now go and query anywhere. So even in between the grid points, you can ask, what is the output here? And you can come up with a prediction. And that's the beauty of it, that you get super resolution for free without having to do any kind of retraining or any additional layers to do that, or any other interpolation. So how do we go about doing this? I just want to quickly show, like, if we did use a linear partial differential equation, it has this nice form as the inverse of differentiation is integration. And if the model is linear, then this solution is also linear. So this is the Green's function, this kappa here, and this is a well-known form. For instance, if you do heat diffusion, you would have a form like this. So if we design like blocks that computed this kind of integral linear form, right? So one that can also compute this integration on any point in the domain. So any query point X here, you can come up with this solution. Then we have the ability to solve partial differential equations that are linear. If we have, and I'll tell you in a minute what those blocks look like. But assume you had such a system that could solve this. I mean, this is still limiting because we are only learning linear partial differential equations this way. On the other hand, if we add nonlinear activations, then we make the model expressive, right? So you can now compose layers that solve for integral linear operator and compose it with nonlinearity to come up with expressive model. And so some examples of this could be your familiar graph neural network. The only difference is in standard graph neural networks, you fix the number of points beforehand and fix the edges. But here, at test time, we allow to add new points, query points, and then you look at forming edges based on the spatial neighborhood. And based on this, once you learn the kernel, you can also apply the kernel on new added points. And this allows us to now come up with predictions at any resolution. Yeah, so the graph models are a familiar way to handle both irregular grid as well as the ability to go to any resolution. But on the other hand, this can be limiting if the phenomena has a global reach, right? So if there is global correlations present and you try to make your graph only local, you cannot capture the full complexity of it. On the other hand, if you make the graph global, it's too expensive because you have to compute this kernel between any 2 points, and that's a quadratic cost. The other approach is instead to use a Fourier-based approach because it captures global correlations very well. So you can do this now. Convolution becomes multiplication in the Fourier domain, which many of you may not remember from your signal processing or a similar class. But the idea is, we can use the Fourier as a change of basis and learn coefficients in the Fourier domain. But on the other hand, we still have nonlinear activations. So meaning our end-to-end basis is not just the Fourier, right? That would be what the traditional approaches used. Now it's richer, but it still keeps some of the inductive bias and the ability to capture global correlations well. So you can think of like the pseudospectral solver is a traditional numerical solver. It solves for the iterations in the Fourier domain, comes back to the standard domain through inverse Fourier transform and repeats this. But there's no nonlinear activations in between, right? Whereas with the Fourier neural operator, we are adding those nonlinear activations. We are adding nonlinear also encoders and decoders to lift this to higher dimensions. So a lot of different operations because of those nonlinearity helps us come up with a much more expressive model. And so you can think of also the traditional solvers as a special case of neural operators. And so that way we always retain this ability to have at least one candidate that does solve the required partial differential equation. But on the other hand, you can instead learn from data itself what is the best set of features or best basis rather than force upon the problem or hand engineer it. And that's really the benefit of using these models.
Sorry, just to jump in, I think we're running a bit short on time, so if we can wrap up in like 5 minutes or so, then save time for some questions, that'd be great.
Sure,
Thank you so
sure.
much.
Yeah, I'm happy to wrap up quite quickly. In fact, I was going to say you can combine like these Fourier-based approaches and graph-based approaches to have a mix of both local features and global features and combine them effectively. So you can use that for problems like automotive aerodynamics, for instance. This is done on industrial scale. And just to kind of hone in a little bit more on what are some unique properties of neural operators, right? So the one I want to emphasize is once you train the model, you can now run the model at different resolutions. But it's not just that, it has a nice consistency property, meaning as you refine the mesh at test time, your solution also converges. So it's not like if you suddenly go from this coarse mesh to a fine mesh, right? It suddenly gives you a different solution. There's a nice convergence property, and that's what makes it trustworthy. Like you can now kind of go to super resolution and still get reasonable answers. And the other aspect is it's also discretization invariant because the architecture doesn't change even if you change the discretization or resolution. So it still remains the same, and that's the benefit. And you can also see that in plots, our ability to work at multiple resolutions. Yeah, so this was the same I had before, so I will I think I'll skip this. This is some more details if you want to capture multiple partial differential equations using neural operators, but I will stop that here, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, Anima. Do we have any questions in the room? Yeah. I think I'm closer up here.
Thank you, Anima. Great talk. My question is that you mentioned about the Fourier neural operators. Signal processing, going back, as you mentioned, the old school things, you can use Fourier transforms basically to do inverse modeling and understand processes that are driving the signals. So I wonder how this would open for interpretability of those neural networks, but using common principles that we share from traditional signal processing, and how would that be on Fourier neural operators? Thank you.
Sorry, I couldn't fully hear the question well, but I think from what I could understand, you're asking about interpretability, right? Like compared to, the standard like signal processing realm, you can go from standard basis to Fourier basis, you come back, right? It's
exactly. Yeah, the forward process and a backward process. Yes, the synthesis.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's invertible, but once you have nonlinear activations in between, that's no longer true. Okay. Right? But that's true for other standard neural networks as well. So that's a trade-off you make when you're making it more expressive. I guess the traditional approach of interpretability may not remain anymore.
Okay, thank you.
I'm seeing, one more question back there in the room. And sorry, if you could just introduce yourself since Anima's online and can't see. Sorry about that, Ricardo. I forgot on that one.
Hi, Anima. This is David John Gagne from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. One question I had was how well does the FNO and other neural operators capture the fractal dimension of a field? So like when you scale to higher resolution, do you see the self-similar like smaller whirls and eddies, even if they like basically similar to larger scale, but at those smaller resolutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I showed the frequency spectrum, right? So this um, like kind of energy transfer across scales. In a way, it is extrapolating beyond to the finer scales and able to follow a similar trend. So in a way, it's even without adding in the physics laws, it's able to do quite well on those aspects. So it is kind of getting that frequency plot to be, you know, fairly accurate, even when it hasn't seen all of the resolutions during training.
Well, one quick follow-up too. Have you or anyone in your team had a chance to take like ForecastNet or some version of it and like double the resolution and see if it still runs at the higher resolution?
Yeah, we did do that, and in fact, we found it to kind of gracefully extend to higher resolution, and in fact, some of the climate models we did train it with fine tuning on just limited higher resolution data, right? So the aspect that it's very easy to now add in like a little bit of high resolution data into the same model and further improve that result. So you can do both. You can do zero shot or you can do few shot. And in both cases, that was quite good with ForecastNet.
Thank you. I think I want to take a few questions from Slido. There's a question from Harrison Cook. You discussed the distortions alleviated by treating the spherical data correctly, but the SFNO seem to show artifacts at the poles. Why do you think this is, and can you maybe comment on that?
Yeah, so the other model had such artifacts that just kept growing, right? So there's always like kind of some, it's more sensitivity at the poles. This is also true with traditional models that use spherical harmonics. So this is a well-known aspect because it's more sensitive there at the poles compared to the equator.
Thanks. And another one, could you maybe just comment on how you think ForecastNet compares with some of the other big forecasting models that have been coming out? We had a keynote yesterday from the GenCast team, and yeah, I think just the audience might be curious to hear about how you think ForecastNet, maybe the strengths and weaknesses, things that it does better or worse.
Well, the ForecastNet was the first one, right? And so I see this as a natural Cambrian evolution of more models once we see some success. So I'm very happy to see that. And yeah, I mean, the GenCast is a generative model, right? So you can sample from it. We don't have that ability with ForecastNet or even GraphCast and others. And to me, I think the aspect that the ForecastNet has this spherical geometry and others sometimes scares some of the people. Oh, this is too complicated. Let's just use a graph-based model. And on the other hand, if you really want to extrapolate to longer time scale rollout or other aspects, those do have benefits. So that's how I see it.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we have time for probably one more question, and then we'll need to wrap up for the day.
Hi, Anima. This is Mark from UCL. I have a non-technical question. So you've been open sourcing code for, I think, pretty much throughout your career. And maybe you can comment on kind of like the benefits or maybe the problems with open sourcing, and in particular, open sourcing the code for the neural operators.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. To me, the open source is how, as a community, we've grown in machine learning, right? And this is how we can really distill the ingenuity and knowledge of all the researchers together. And so we welcome contributions. We have a very active user base, and we welcome that all of you contribute to that. I do think that I only see the positives, because once ForecastNet was open source. That was the first model to be open sourced under Apache license. There was just this like huge aspect of democratization where people, right, in countries that may be not as well served with current weather models can go fine tune with the data locally. And I think this is how we enable further development and democratization.
Thank you. I think with that, we will go ahead and close this session. So if we can give Anima another round of applause for a wonderful talk.